welcome to this next edition of The Value Exchange. I'm Annabelle Lambert and I am here with my regular co-host Rob Pye. Say hello, Rob Pye.
Hello, Annabelle.
Thank you. We are delighted today to be joined by Zack Polanski, who is the Deputy Leader of the Green Party in England and Wales currently. He's also an elected member of the London Assembly, and we have met Zack through a good friend of ours, Professor Guy Standing, primarily around the subject of basic income, but not here primarily to talk about that today. So
I wanted to come in here and disclose that after I met with Guy and Zack at the book launch, I became a member of the Green Party, and I have never been. It was no lobbying. It was not, I've never been a member of a political party, but it's quite an important part of my story. And I wanted to disclose that rather than at the end when I go, oh, by the way, I figure it's kind of good to get that stuff up front, because I was victim of a 2-hour lecture, which is of a totally independent report on something that was to do with all political parties, with the author disclosed right at, oh, by the way, I'm a member of the Conservative Party, and he was deep into the gubbins of that particular political. So I just wanted to kind of get that up front. But anyway, back to you, Annabelle, in terms of the introduction.
So thank you for that, Rob. So Zack, where we start is right at the beginning. So wherever you wish to choose to put that pin, please tell us about yourself. The earlier the better.
Thank you both so much for having me on. I really appreciate it, and I've enjoyed listening to your other podcast too. And it's always lovely to see people joining. I feel like I'm avoiding your question. I'm not meaning to. I'm going to come straight back to your question, but I guess it's a humble brag, but I love sharing it. Last week, I had one of my favorite gigs that I've ever done in my entire time as a politician, which is I do a lot of speaking to school groups of all sorts of ages. It's just something I enjoy, particularly because students, they often ask you questions that aren't the questions journalists ask you over and over again. That's nothing against journalists, but because they're often in the same circles, they're asking the same questions they've seen their colleagues ask. So, they start the sentence and my brain goes, oh, I know how to answer this question. And I feel like I try and stay alive and in the moment, and I'll come back to that in a minute, why I try and do that, or why I think it's important to do that. But it's very difficult when you're asked stock questions. It's a bit like being an actor and doing a show for 600, 700 times, and absolutely it should be in your skill set to hear it for the first time, but it requires more work than when a young person asks you a question you've never heard before or sees the world in a different light. And I just love that moment to moment, keeps you authentic in that moment, thinking, actually, how am I going to answer this? Because the world is complicated and you can work out your workings out. So anyway, I did this event last Tuesday, this Tuesday. It's been a long week, and it was 2,000 sixth formers. So this wasn't like one school group. This was walking in, and it was in Westminster. And it was genuinely like Wembley Arena. Like there's pictures of it. It's just students on every side, all across the country. And the lineup they'd had was Jacob Rees-Mogg, who'd spoken in the morning, then Wes Streeting, then Richard Tice on the same day that Lee Anderson had joined Reform UK, and then they had me. So before I'd even opened my mouth, that crowd of young people were ready for something different, were ready for something hopeful in the idea that change was possible. And I just had the best kind of time with them. Yes, giving the spiel I would give to any crowd, but then just taking questions and just having that genuine conversation on a big arena level. And sure, I'd like to think that I love those kind of atmosphere, that atmosphere anyway, but I think the students got a lot of that out of it. In fact, I know the students got a lot out of it because the amount of emails I've had since from people joining the party or asking more about the party. It's just this really beautiful moment, not just because obviously I want to grow the Green Party, that's the political part of it. But the bit I loved more than that was just how many people said things like, I didn't think there was a party for me, or I've never been inspired by politics. And just for 17, 18-year-olds to be talking about politics, recognizing that change is possible, was really, really exciting. Anyway, I'll come back to your question, but I think it was partly Robert saying that he'd never joined a party before it kind of sparked that memory.
Yeah, and then when we get onto it, again, we'll circle back to who on earth you are and how did you get here. But it's how do you, as a party, and don't answer this, just save it for later, but how do you actually if I'm a little person who's 17, 18, 24, how can you make my voice heard? What is it? And I'm a geek, and I wouldn't, and a bit of a cynic because I'm 58. I wouldn't take that as, oh, I just believe you because you're a nice guy. You could, young people are, yeah, they're also pretty, they're pretty damaged. They're going to look behind the scenes and go, how is that? And it's the how are you going to do that is really important. And if you look at technology and the sort of governance and the proposals and that you kind of need a way to listen. And it's, I think we've forgotten that in politics because we go, oh, we come out and bitch moan, once every few years, and then we give it to lots of very old people to kind of then tell us what to do until the next election. But anyway, we should. Right, where did it all start then?
Yeah, and I'm not going to answer that question yet, but I am going to challenge the premise, or not even the premise, because the question is completely right. But also this idea that I know you weren't suggesting this, but that being nice is kind of not enough, and I would agree it's not enough, but I do think it's necessary. And when I say nice, I'm more meaning compassionate, authentic, like genuinely listen to people. And I'm thinking of this because I'm sat right now in City Hall where we've just had our last mayor's question of the term. We're all about to go into elections. And it was pretty fierce. There was a lot of shouting across the chamber, mainly from Labour and Conservatives. But I also played my role in that with the mayor in terms of having a bit of a Labour Green disagreement. Now, to my defence, I started the disagreement by pointing out to the mayor that although we're from different parties, he's done loads of important good work for London, and I think it's churlish not to recognise that. And I've always seen my role, whoever I'm working with, to cooperate with them as much as possible, and to amplify when they do the right things, and celebrate when they do the right things, but at the same time expose when there's gaps in the plans or when I think there's things going wrong.
Yeah.
But I do think that kind of niceness often gets brushed aside in politics as if that's just a kind of unimportant detail. But actually, I think it's really vital. And one thing I really enjoyed about this mayor's question time, we don't normally do this, is afterwards all the 25 assembly members all went off for a small reception together. And we all chatted. Now, I know to some people this would bother them in politics because it can add to the sense of they all go to the same parties and they all believe the same and we're being shut out. And I think there's an element of truth to that in politics, certainly with the two kind of big established old parties. But I'm going to be very honest. I sat and chatted to a Conservative colleague, and we just had a human conversation. Now we're about to go into elections where I will fiercely and firmly oppose nearly every single part of her politics and put against a robust defence against what she stands for. But I think that ability to be able to connect with a human being and to be able to see their humanity and recognise, even if you don't support their politics and even if you will call them out, if their politics can even be depraved, that you will still, as much as possible, work to build a relationship that is that sees someone's humanity. Now, there's a balance there where I think politics can worry sometimes too much about appropriateness. And I think appropriateness in the face of a climate crisis or mass inequality sometimes gets overblown. And I think that's where the idea of everyone's in it together comes from. So it's always walking this tightrope between being as appropriate as you need to be civil and see people's humanity, but also recognizing it's really good to do things differently and to speak the truth. Where did it all start? Now I will answer the question. So I guess one thing I've really been reflecting on recently because of world events is I went to a Jewish school that was fairly orthodox. So I grew up with a religious education. And I was not political at all. In fact, even if you'd asked me up until about age 30, maybe, who the leader of the opposition was, I probably wouldn't have been able to name them. So to say I had, a little interest in politics would be an understatement. I had no interest whatsoever in formal party politics. What I have always been, though, is a rebel. I've never particularly liked being told what to do. And I've always enjoyed who is the underdog in this situation? Who is the marginalized person? Who is the community or person who is not being heard? And what can I do to amplify their voice or help to support them to be seen and heard? So I think even at that early education, growing up in a Jewish school, that immediately, it others you and it others other people. And I think even growing up, there was that sense of division, of being treated differently, that already sparked a rebelliousness in me in terms of how you see the world and what do you do. Going a few years later, I got very much into drama, particularly into drama because my parents were having a difficult time. They got divorced, and I think there was a sense of what do we do with him in the evening. So going to a drama club was kind of the obvious, easy thing to do. I was quite a shy young person. This is a a story as old as the hills, I think, when people go to drama and arts, and it's why I believe arts and culture is so important. That yes, I was learning drama, but I was learning humanity. I was learning how to speak. I was learning the power of your voice. I was learning how to operate with a team of people in a collective endeavor. All of those reasons why drama, arts, and music should absolutely be taught in every single school. Whether someone picks it up or not, I think should be their choice. And I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had about free schools. A friend of
Yeah,
mine grew
I
up
mean,
in Birmingham.
we just had one on arts and culture. It was a massively moving story, but who sort of found his feet, metaphorically speaking, because he was given the opportunity. In fact, he was 5 years old when he went to some pottery
Wow.
classes, and it, he never found the education system, was for him. He didn't feel that he was getting. Did you feel similarly? So I'm just winding back to the Jewish education, that with the religion or the education, or was that a good fit for you? Was it a bad fit? Was that did you have your place there, and you also had your place in the arts, or was it, in terms of your
I think
story? Was that?
I think it couldn't have been a worse fit, to be honest. And it's hard to run into a counterfactual universe. So I don't know if that's because it was a religious education and that's never sat with me. I don't know if it's because, difficulty that at family home at that time. But I would say, even into secondary school, I was bullied quite badly. Never felt part of the community. Certainly didn't have any confidence. So all of those things were going on, and then I got involved with something called Manchester Youth Theatre, which was a kind of 2 week, actually, I think it was 3 week residential where you went away and for 3 weeks you spent time, I must have been 14, 15 with your peers. Also, sorry, adding to this being gay as well and knowing at 14 you're gay but not wanting to say anyone and not saying anything to anyone and all those extra complications. Going away for this 3 week residential with Manchester Youth Theatre at 14 was just completely transformational. It was that being with a group of people who had similar interests and similar cares. But I wasn't presenting the story in this reason, and I think this is an example of when you're being in the moment and you discover new things. But I guess the reflection I'm having a light bulb is I just talked about that tightrope between having authenticity and listening, but also caring about appropriate, but also not caring too much. And that's literally what being in a rehearsal room is. Like, good art is being willing to push the boundaries, to even overstep the boundaries, but at the same time working collectively with people, looking at cooperation, looking at testing that cooperation and going, is it working right now? Are the dynamics that can be found here? Making sure that you're recognizing everyone's contribution in the room, the diversity in the room. I think all of those things were things I was learning at Manchester Youth Theatre, not despite my problems in life, but because of the problems in my life. So I don't regret any of my childhood. It's where I am now. But also at the same time, I think probably, we can always make up stories in hindsight, and it's impossible to know if this is a story you've now constructed to make the stepping stones to get where you are. But to me, there's a compelling narrative of rebelliousness and creativity and resilience to difficult circumstances that led to the person I am now. Because having left the youth theatre, I then got very involved with something called Theatre of the Oppressed, which I know I've spoken to you both about before. Just very briefly for someone who hasn't come across this, this came about from Augusto Boal in the 1970s. He was working in South America with people in the favelas, some of the poorest communities. And essentially, what he was doing was working with communities who were facing oppression, whether that be from the police, from the state, from landlords, whoever it might be, where they felt like they didn't have a collective voice. And Boal would call this rehearsing the revolution. He would get a group of people together to watch actors, but he was always keen that they were not spectators, they were spect actors. So at any point during the play, there would be a moment of oppression where someone would have a choice. And he would turn to the audience and say, what should this person do? What are their options? Someone would put their hand up and say, well, I think they could do this. And Boal, he wasn't a facilitator. He was called the Joker. And even the term the Joker gives you kind of an idea of the free flow of this and the playful nature, would say, no, don't tell me, get up and show me. And suddenly the audience member is thrust into being an actor within this play. And then the actor would do it, and then the audience member, the spect actor, would present an option, and the actors would then respond honestly in what they think the situation would be. Would that resolve it? Would it make it worse? Would it create a new problem? And then audience members would be able to rewind and go, let's look at the different choices here. Let's try it with different people. Let's try with different options. they would then often create these different options into legislation and into imaginary legislation. And this is called legislative theatre. So, how do a group of people through art look at different options, explore different avenues, and then go to people in power and say, we as a community, which is the most powerful thing you can be. I say people in power, but actually, the people in the community should be the ones really in power, saying to their public servants, as a group of people, we would like to see this from our democracy, and then have the people respond. So I was really caught by this work. I came across it through various work I was doing with immersive theatre. I'll go into that in a second. And so I started to get involved with different groups, whether they were groups of homeless people, young renters who were facing landlords, migrants who were facing what they would determine as illegal raids from the police. And even then, I was working with audience members. If you see an illegal raid, how do you intervene with the police? What are the things you can say? What shouldn't you say? What are your best option points? How might you deal with the police if they're being responsive to you? How might you deal with them if they're being firm and assertive with you? And just creating those options. Now, I absolutely love that work, and I've been really pleased to applaud and support that work ever since being elected. But there comes a point, or it came a point for me, where I was working with lots of groups to empower their voice, to help them find new voices, to help them hold their space, to do just basic public speaking training. And then I guess I got to a point where I go, you can help someone so far, but if the systemic barriers are so strong and so high, then someone can be the most articulate person in the world. But if the structures are not in place to support them, or even worse, if the structures are in place to actively silence their voice or to oppress them, then actually you need to change the structures. Now, the question is always, was the art more important or was the politics more important? And the question is completely the wrong question. Both of these things need to happen in their different spaces, in those siloed spaces. And as always with silos, they should never just be in silos, because the specific should become the general. And you want to make sure that those things are all working together. And then the very final thing I kind of add to this, because I've been speaking for a long time, is the work I was most passionate about as an actor. And actually, I couldn't love my jobs more that I do in politics. But if I had one, I wouldn't quite call it a regret, but every so often wistful thought, is I was also doing work in immersive theatre. Immersive theatre is where people might go into a building or a warehouse. I think at its best, the audience member has complete free range to do whatever they want, go wherever they want, and the story happens around them. I was doing a lot of immersive theatre, and I don't think I ever connected this to politics, but the first immersive theatre I was doing was with a company called Punch Drunk, who do incredible theatre, or with a group who are associated with them. But all their work, as amazing as it is, involves the audience member wearing a mask. And no matter what they do, they can never change what happens within the theatre space. The play or the performance will play out with the beginning, middle, and end. And the audience member gets to choose how they see it, what moments they might see a murder and run after the murderer, or they might choose to stay with the body and see the police arrive. It's completely up to them how they construct the narrative, but they can't change the narrative. And then I started to get involved with theatre companies who were more involved with creating games and playing games. And one of my favourite pieces I ever did was a piece at the Tower of London, where I would meet the audience at the tube station, dressed in a hood, and they are revolutionaries. And we were going to take the Tower of London, which was the Peasants' Revolt in the 1600s. And we were looking at a modern version of the Peasants' Revolt. So I'd meet the audience at the tube. We would go into an underground tunnel near the Tower of London, and I would have a 20-minute segment with them where I would say, I'm the leader of this movement, but I need you to be the leaders. If anything ever happened to me, how would we make decisions? And the audience would have this fascinating 20-minute discussion about how the communities make decisions. And it was amazing how often they jumped straight to democracy, straight to voting. But other audiences would say, the person with the loudest voice, the person who can run the fastest, rock, paper, scissors. Sometimes these random decisions. They would have all of these different decisions. Now, it's a spoiler, but the show's gone away, sadly. But 20 minutes later, I'm kidnapped. My character is gone. And the audience are thrust into a position with no actor in the room. We're watching on cameras, but they have to make these decisions. Most audiences would choose to stick with the system they'd chosen. Some audiences, based on new stresses that were thrown into the show, would destroy that, and very quickly it was often older white men who would make the decisions. Sometimes audiences would be more aware of their choices, and it would be the young black woman making the decision in the group. So there was always very different decisions about how audiences went, but that run went on for about 6 weeks, and I learned so much doing that run about politics, about community. I'm not kind of stipulating from this that there needs to be another peasants' revolt, or we need to use rock, paper, scissors to make decisions. But where did it all begin? I think it all began back at school. But I think theatre and art and playing with the theatrical form in the way that politics and decision making and democracy happens all kind of added up to the politician I am, which meant that on my very first time of being elected, the first thing I asked for mayor was about bringing people's voices into the chamber and encouraging people to make decisions, encouraging people to be paid to make decisions. Because if you just encourage people to work for free, it's great that you get volunteers, but there will always be volunteers who can choose to work for free, as opposed to those marginalized voices who are struggling to pay rent or put food on the table. And it's actually those people we need to be empowering to get in the space to be scrutinizing policies. Sorry, I said last thing, but the very, very, very last thing, really inspired by a young person the other day who I was talking about how proud I was that the Young Green Party have lots of young Greens elected. And then the Conservative MP after me said, yes, I'm really inspired by young people. And a young person put their hand up and said, no, listen to what Zack said. He said, let's not be inspired by them. He said, let's get them into positions of power. And I think that's the key difference here is it can't be tokenism. It has to be about empowering the next generation. It doesn't have to just be young people. It can be older people too who have lots to say and lots of experience. But bringing people who haven't traditionally been in the political experience and empowering them to be able to use their voices for good. Sorry, that was a very long answer. But you did say, where did it start?
And my head is now spinning, and I feel we need to do a slow unpick of that, because there's some themes in, if I can remember even some of it in what you've said, that I think they're just worth slowing down. And what is it that we're talking about here? And in the sort of, was it theatre of oppressed you were talking about that?
Yeah.
So in a political context, how do you give voice to the great unwashed, the mass, the proletariat, the voters, the population? And part of it, and I want to just pause the conversation. I'm just going to try and deconstruct into two bits. Part of it is people having the knowledge that they've got a voice that's going to be listened to. And then part of it is, well, what is the system that is there to listen to that voice? Is that fair to say two things? Now, in the context of those two things, isn't it also the case that in a society that it's not just the politics that is suffering with this, it's the work that we do? Because if I am a worker, as opposed to an owner or a director or somebody up there, then I might also be suffering from these two sides of the problem that maybe improv could do something to there as well. Which is we're involved in conversations, and the first being, if I've got a something I want to say, how do I say it and how do I listen to it? Then how does that fit into the structures? And so in the context of schooling, Zack and Orthodox school and being a bit of a rebel and a misfit, and then discovering theatre and art. What about all the people who, in the education system are going, well, you could get a proper job and become a doctor or an accountant. But if you want to do art, or if you want to do something that's not on my list of, what we've done, then so there is a point of helping people land that is so important. And it's about, who am I? What do I like? Do I like sitting in a classroom and learning about formulas? Or, some people they love that. A lot of people they don't like doing that. So I think the experiments. So theatre you could see as a life experiment. Annabelle, you went to Shakespeare the other night in a warehouse, and I don't know whether that was immersive in that way, but it was certainly
not completely. But it wasn't traditional theatre,
that's right. All your dogs are barking. It's on and off. It's like it's Friday afternoon when we're recording this.
But I've always been moved by stories I've heard in the past about live action role playing, which is not it's not the same, but it's not dissimilar. And it's interesting to hear, people come up while you're in the room, Zach, and people are going, yeah, this is what we're doing. And as soon as you've gone and you're in that experience, it's like, how do you react in a crisis? How do you really react? Well, you have no idea until you're in a crisis what your behaviour is going to be like. So it's quite very interesting human behaviour in that way. What we do.
So to link those two things together, then you've got politics, you've got work, and you've got finding your voice, and then having the systems to. I'd like to unpick this. So, as a practical example, we've got a project where there's a police director in Scotland running, a senior guy, violence reduction unit. His story, when we get him to tell it on the podcast, we haven't done it yet, but he had he grew up in care, so care homes, and he was a care leaver, and then so he's kind of got that lived experience. He wants and is in the process of setting up a board, GLA or whatever, but for his violence reduction, of young people who have lived experience to then tell the police what they should be doing to sort of solve the problem of violence. Just like such an obvious, brilliant idea, and paying them, to do that job, and bringing them into the system to actually govern it. So you've kind of got, not only are we listening, but we're changing the system to democratize it a bit. And so I wonder, in politics, where I know, we may get into proportional representation and, how the Green Party works, but how can I practically engage in politics so that it's not just a happy, nice listening politician that on the voting day convinces me to vote, but actually that there is this continuous engagement, where I can get involved in politics. And I love the story Guy Standing says that, in ancient Greek time, this was considered valuable work for everybody to get involved in this stuff, to do, to get engaged. We seem to have lost that. We've outsourced it to elite politicians, and then, so how do we do more of this improv in real life, of getting people engaged in it?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One is more difficult and one's easier. I'll start with the more difficult. So the work that you talked about, the Violent Reduction Unit, we actually have that in London. So we have a youth board who are paid to give evidence. And in fact, Kai, who's just on the other side of this wall, is a young apprentice. He's on my team and has been shadowing me, but actually she's on that youth board. And it's always really interesting to hear quite regularly from her, one, what she thinks and she's saying to the board, but two, how she feels like that process is working. Now, I've been trying to replicate that process in various ways. One thing I've been pushing is something called a climate panel, which would be a group of marginalised and diverse voices in London who want to talk about the mayor's policies on the environment. So it might be that they want to save the park at the end of their street. It might be talking about how can we protect Indigenous communities around the world. It might be whatever it is, from the hyper-local to the big international. And when I kind of push this to the mayor, his answer always to me is that marginalised voices are already at the table. Now, I'm not on this podcast just to bash Sadiq Khan. He's a lot better than Boris Johnson was. But I think this is a real example of this top-down approach. Whereas, I wasn't arguing for a second, and nor am I, that some marginalised voices are at the table and there's some marginalised voices in his team. Excellent, let's applaud that. But the idea that all marginalised voices in London are at the table is just beyond absurd. And I'm not suggesting I could ever get all marginalised voices at the table. But what I am suggesting is that we need a system in place that actually reaches out to those people to encourage them to be at the table as long as they want to be at the table and to create their own tables. My one adjunct to this, though, is I also tried this with the London Fire Commissioner recently. I said that if people, if they've been through the Grenfell fire or whatever the fire may be, their expertise is really important to hear for future advice. Someone who's a fire officer or senior in the fire service, I have great respect for what they do, but their knowledge can only go to a certain point. Whereas someone who's had a lived experience of being in the fire and having those moments has something really urgent to tell. But if you're taking someone's trauma and seeing that as expertise, which it should be, you absolutely need to pay them for their time and effort for all the reasons that I've just said. Now, the commissioner responded to me really well last week, and I don't have an answer yet, and it's always interesting to be in that bit. He said he hears me in theory, but he's also worried about the impression of paying people to hear what we want to hear. And that was really interesting, because I think it's perceptive of him that there is this kind of fundamental problem of, if the money is coming from the same organisation, which is asking you to scrutinize it, then there is a conflict of interest there. Now, the answer I think I've got for London, but we could extrapolate it to other cities, is there needs to be some kind of pattern to how this all happens. So it's not me going to each department or institution and saying, oh, you should have this thing where you pay people to scrutinize your policies and you should pay them X. It should actually just be a standard policy across the board that all institutions, all policies have fed experience of people into them, and not just once, but actually there's that kind of feedback loop. I've been working on what does good engagement look like, and I've not finished. I still need to engage with people about what good engagement looks like. But I think I've come up with 3 principles that seem sound to me at the moment. One is that people should set the agenda. So it shouldn't be that the politicians or the organizations decide what is on the menu or what isn't. People should set the agenda. Second, they should be paid for their time and effort. I've said that several times. And 3, it's really important. They should be able to feed back in to how satisfied or not they are with the outcome of the agenda they set, the advice they've given, and what's happened based on the recommendations they've had. Now, as I'm saying all of this links into the easier bit. This isn't for everyone.
Can I just, because we've got to unpick you a bit.
Yeah.
Not just
Can I finish the sentence though, just in case it gets misconstrued? When I say this isn't for everyone, it is for everyone, but lots of people wouldn't want to do it. That's all I mean by this isn't for everyone. Some people would go, "Oh my god, I don't want to sit down with politicians and talk to them." Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no. So the commissioner, the fire commissioner, where it was, here's the problem. So in accounting, you've got this thing called an audit, where if you're a big company, you will pay Ernst & Young or KPMG to come and look at your books and then mark your homework and say whether you're embezzling money and whether it all is, etc. And so, I think we have to be practical about this sort of, these, how you manage the conflicts of interest. And we know that's not, it's that industry is not without massive problems where you've got money and you've got, you're paying people to mark your homework and come out with the result that you want. And it's a perennial problem, but it doesn't mean to say that actually that you should not be paying people. It's kind of, you're conflating, and the moral issue of labour with, of course they need to, paying people is a problem to be solved, rather than, we shouldn't pay them because it creates any conflict. And I think the other thing of, people with lived experience, that the other angle of that is that you need people with skin in the game to kind of, people with that lived experience to be able to relate to the problems that are being solved. And for lots of, yes, we listen to the public, we've had a consultation, and then it goes into a black hole. And then what happens? The magic fairies, if bureaucrats come on and go, well, no, yes, we took all of that into consideration and we did what we thought we were going to do about 3 years ago anyway. So I think that it's back to the question of how, your 3 principles, how we are forced to get people involved to know what it feels like to be in a building on fire, and then to actually allow people to make key decisions and live with them that's what Nassim Taleb calls skin in the game. Sorry, I interrupt because you wanted to move on to something else, and I was going to forget if I didn't make the point then. But
no, and your intervention actually has really helped me with something else, because I'm often operating on 2 levels as everyone, well, lots more levels as everyone is, but the 2 levels I can really hear in my voice right now are the very specific detailed work I do in my elected role in London to get one step ahead. And I don't regret that work. I think it's really important, and that's the work I'm talking about right now. But as soon as you reflected back to me, I was just like, this is all such minor stuff. If we had a universal basic income, we wouldn't need to be paying people for time and expertise, because everyone would have security and everyone would be able to choose, do they want to get involved in politics? Yeah, exactly. And so that's a much more big visionary thing. So I much prefer to operate at visionary and to kind of think of those big level things. I suppose because I'm in this building and I've just come from Mayor's questions, part of my brain is, how do you use the power you have in that moment? And not that can't be visionary as well, but very often it's you kind of have to push visionary away temporarily and go, what is the practical step towards visionary to keep moving this agenda along?
And I had
Um,
so we happened to have a Green councillor locally, and I had him round for a cup of tea recently, and he was saying a lot of the stuff that I'm doing in the council feels very meaningless because we're not able to push the change that we're challenging. And it was about green investment, and we're doing 50 million in this and 50 million in that, and it's like how do we ensure that at least everything we do is in a green compliant investment that is actually part of a green standards initiative. And it was only when we got to the big vision, operating at that bigger vision level, that it was like, no, you got to keep you're doing what people like myself could not do. He happened to have experience in his life as a disconnected youth worker or an outplaced youth, where he would be with people, knife crimes and drugs and violence, and just not try to police, but to try and understand and communicate and work with that group. And it was only when we did the vision stuff, which was, look, just imagine where this could be if everybody did a tiny little bit like that, said 7 billion people on the world. And I think it's that it's the micro to the macro switching all the time, because if we wake up every day and go, who am I to say something that people might listen, said 7 billion other people, it's like, no, if we did that, we wouldn't be here talking about problems, would we? Surely, because we would actually have a tiny bit of headspace to just, say, no, stop, this is no good, I'm going to do something different. So I think it's a great point you make of these two levels,
Well, you're onto my favourite subject too, because whenever I speak to green councillors around the country, if they're feeling every so often frustrated, or is their contribution, if they're just one councillor in the 60 of another party, they go, kind of, what difference can I make? And it's exactly that. It's creating that link between the micro and macro, because actually, if you have 60 people in the room who all see the exact same way, there is nothing more powerful than just having one person who can just use their voice and say, is this the right way, or have we explored other options? Now, they might not always win every vote. In fact, they might not win any votes. They might be ridiculed. They might be, scorned. That will only happen for a little while, though. If you can find your groove and you're able to speak authentically with compassion, if you're able to create that connection, people will be hearing every single time you're in that council chamber, or you're in, if it's for House of Commons. Caroline Lucas has demonstrated this amazingly. One Green MP, 600 odd MPs from other parties, all thinking from a range of, close to Caroline to could not be further. They're totally there for private profit and the destruction of the earth, everything on that spectrum. But I think any of them would recognize the role that Caroline makes when she stands there and she speaks the truth, and she makes that difference. So this comes back to the easier part of your earlier question about making the difference. So
Thank you.
Without going too party political, because I'm always just keen at, it's always more interesting to talk about other things. It is what the Green Party is at its heart, is that although I'm the deputy leader, that's, it's essentially a title that really should be spokesperson, because I don't make party policy, I don't make strategic decisions. Whether someone joined a month ago, a couple of years ago, or they join tomorrow morning, every single person in the party does have equal power. Now, is there a different power in terms of soft power? Of course. I'm doing podcasts, I'm on media. That means you have more of an ability to influence the conversation. But actually, when it comes down to making policy or making decisions, any member can find, forget the numbers, but it's roughly 20 to 25 other members, write a policy together, bring it to our national conference that is then debated on. We're incredibly democratic. Even the order that we debate things is voted on, so the priority kind of thing to be debated goes to the top, etc. And then if it doesn't pass, then that can't come back for 6 months. So yes, that's in the long grass. But if it passes, as things more often than not do, then that is then party policy. And that's this beautiful kind of democratic, big kind of huge organism, which is chaotic, which sometimes takes too long to make decisions, sometimes is unwieldy, but actually I would defend with every ounce of my being, because I think that kind of sense and vision of everything coming together is really important. Now, the missing bit I often feel, particularly when people have just joined the party, is they get very involved with the policy and very interested in the policy, and the kind of running elections thing becomes less interesting because it feels more like the old way of doing things, whereas the kind of policy making, the democratic part, feels like the important, the interesting bit. But I always argue that creating that manifesto, creating those policies is important in itself. But ultimately, every single person we get elected is moving towards being able to change communities, is moving towards being able to empower voices. So, although everything I've said so far kind of sometimes leads to, well, why is this person in politics at all? Why are they not just doing community work, or why are they not just working with voices? But actually, you've got to connect this micro and the macro. Is the macro bit as democratic and as organic as the micro bit? No, I don't think it is. I'd be disingenuous if I said I think we've completely got rid of top-down politics, because ultimately the political system is top-down. So getting people elected, you then have to look in these current systems. How do you work the system? Now we know how to get people elected. How do you work within that system as much as possible while still giving people autonomy? But the beautiful bit is once people are elected, we don't have a whip. And a whip just means, on a council, someone who is telling people how to vote, or in the House of Commons, you see whips with big parties that say to them, you can't use your independence of thought. We would never have that. So even once someone is elected, they can look at our party policies. I'd encourage them to vote with our party policies. But ultimately, we entrust that person who has been elected to make decisions based on what their heart says, along with party policy. Now, if someone says, but how do we hold them accountable? Well, there's elections every few years, and that is the way to hold someone accountable.
So,
I think there's a legitimate...
You don't have a tarantula on your desk then, Zack, when people come to visit you? No?
No. Good
Your tactics.
I said I'm rebellious, but that's actually the general trend of people who arrive at the Green Party. So I'm talking about how we don't have a top-down approach, but even if we did, I just don't think I'd be very good at it, because I don't think, and knowing the councillors and elected people we have, I don't think I'd last very long if I tried to tell anyone what to do.
If we look at, so I often introduce myself as a sort of anti-bureaucrat, and we often use the expression minimum viable bureaucracy. You have to have some way of organising. It has to work. So, as a newly interested Green Party member, I was doing technical due diligence on, okay, I can log on, I can see where the proposals are, I can see the next meeting, I can see all the volunteers, I can see this. Now, this resonates with my work side of life. This is back to this dual, you've got bottom up, you've got politics, and you've got actually how do you do work in the world, and they're sort of both constructed like our political democracies at the moment. They don't feel very democratic. If I look at my geeky side, you can go on to software engines like GitHub. Anybody can make a proposal. Anybody can make code. Anybody can make a proposal to, improve a blockchain or a crypto, project. If you get so many people that agree with your, it becomes, and so this sort of democratic governance for work is also a massive movement globally. And I think if people can realize they can land their feet, what do they believe politically, what do they believe, and actually they can have an authentic voice, they can engage. And I think that the number of experiments that we're involved with around the world that kind of look quite democratic, but the system needs to be changed both on the work front, whether that's universal basic income, or looking at democratic organizations. There's B Corps, there's all kinds of things. But I wonder, in terms of how your political philosophy is sort of impacting the community philosophy, the work bit, the business bit. I just think that they're two halves of the same coin, really. I couldn't, if let's say Green Party in power tomorrow, I can't see that we just go, let's just do this exactly the same things in work as we've done for 200 years. It's not, so where's the working rebel in terms of that democratic organization? How might we improve the voice of, because unions, I mean, bless them, I mean, they've been around, they've still got a place, but surely the answer is not, just the next Arthur Scargill and the sort of that side of unionism. It's a more tech savvy kind of democracy, or is it? Or should we have? I don't know. What's your views on that?
So I think I've got two kind of mainstream streams of thought. So one is when people join the party and speak to me for the first time with ideas, very often the first thing that surprises them more than anything else is how much we leaflet and how much we door knock. And they go, it's 2024. Surely it's about social media. Surely it's about TikTok and Instagram and different kind of various ways of communicating. Now, those things are all important. And I know the Labour Party and Conservative Party in particular spend huge amounts of money on that digital advertising. But actually, all of the research that we've done, both in terms of quantitative research, but also just from my anecdotal experience, there is nothing more powerful. And the romantic in me likes this actually, because I'm not scared of technology, but I like the fact that even in 2024, we found there's nothing more powerful than knocking on someone's door or being in their community space, looking them in the eye and having a conversation in that moment to be able to persuade someone to vote. Now, with the leaflets, you'd think, so why do you need those? Well, there's something called effective frequency. And that demonstrates when someone hears an idea for the first time, they can either be fearful of the idea or it just seems a little bit absurd. By the time they've seen it fourth or fifth time, they might start to consider it within what you call the Overton window, or that kind of like, oh, this is an interesting idea, but I don't quite get how it works. And then we found with our Green Party leaflets, by the 8th or 9th time, which is a lot of volunteers going around putting leaflets through the door, by the 8th or 9th time, people go, the Green Party are working really hard in my area, and they've got some ideas I might engage with. So although that's like the oldest kind of most traditional way of campaigning in the book, we found, and the numbers speak for itself, in places where they go off and do new things, which, I'm fine with that. Again, I'm not top down. So if a local party wants to do something new, my advice would always be go leaflet and door knock. I've seen how that works, but you do you. And I watch with interest, and rarely does it result in someone elected. Now that's fine, because people might have had a good experience. They've tried new things. So I'm not kind of stumping down on that. But if our goal, as it is as a party, is to get people into elected positions of power, to change the interlinking crises and change how we do democracy, then surely the mini goal has to be to get people elected. And so leaflets and door knocking seems to be the way to do that. Now, something that's really interesting about this is one of our kind of core principles is before we even get to the leaflets, when we first knock in a new area, we do something called a 60-second survey, which is knocking on the door and not having any opinions, seemingly, and saying to people, what do you care about? If you had a party in your area campaigning, what would you want them to campaign on? And then we see what they're saying, how that matches with where our national party values are. Now, some people would say, does that mean you say different things to different people? But I always put it like this. You have a market stall in this metaphor. You never change what you sell on that market stall. For me, the things that will never change is I believe that migrants are something that should not be accepted or tolerated, but should be actively celebrated. I believe that we should never put private profits over protecting the planet. I believe that we should be inclusive of the LGBT community. I believe that universal basic income would give collective security to the most marginalized and vulnerable, as well as everyone else. So those are some of my core principles that I go, I can't see a Green Party where those things won't change. So you don't change the things you're selling, but what you do change is the way you communicate about them. And if you're hearing things, you find what is it that matches that I can then present to these people. Now, Burnley in the 1990s is a really interesting case. It had an entirely Labour council. There was not one single opposition councillor on this council. So there was no real democracy, no scrutiny. No one needed to knock on a door and campaign for anyone's vote. People would just go and they'd get Labour. And so the BNP turned up. And the British National Party, for those, I'm sure most people on the call would know who are listening, but I would say they're a far-right fascist party. They would describe themselves as a nationalist party. Whatever words you use, they're pretty far away from Green Party in my personal politics. Now, they did not turn up on the door wearing jackboots or saying we want to kick immigrants out. They turned up on the door and said, we want you to be represented. We want to listen to you. What do you want us to campaign on? And then they campaigned on it. And they won British National Party councillors. They were the first councillors to win, were in Burnley. No talk, as far as I know, of anti-immigration, just talk of people's fears about infrastructure, about doctors' appointments, a sense that the country was leaving them behind. They wanted to take back control, for want of a better different phrase. And what's interesting to me is the BNP weren't running a campaign that's that dissimilar to the Green Party, and I have to recognise that and the uncomfortability in that. And it's interesting because people sometimes, when I explain the party ethos to them, say to me, but how do you separate between your party and populism? And it's interesting because we talk about populism now as a horrible negative thing because it's been grabbed by Donald Trump and Liz Truss and Boris Johnson and now by Rishi Sunak. And I do think populism in its current meaningful term is a terrible thing. But I think we need to grab back the idea of common sense, popular ideas. And I think that can only happen through a uprooting of how we do our democracy. I would say the difference between how the BNP were doing and the Green Party were doing it is we are not turning up with a blank slate. And this comes directly to your question, Robert, I think. I don't think it's entirely about a completely neutral how do we do democratic governance. I think it's about democratic governance that ups people's voices, but you do have people in positions who are not weather vanes, but are signposts and saying, based on the evidence and the science and this collective story, this is where I believe we can go. I am willing to lead you there, not in front of you, not on top of you, but within you. And for me, it's this real question about where leadership is. And it's something I've thought about, yes, as an actor, because I was working in an ensemble where we didn't have a director. And now I think on a daily basis where I'm deputy leader. And some things don't stress me out that I think would stress out leaders of other parties, where the party aren't quite doing what I want them to do. This doesn't happen often, but aren't quite where I would ideally want them to be. And I just think actually leadership is me speaking up, having a voice, but my voice being proportionate in this conversation. And actually, if the party is going a slightly different place that I don't want them to, then it's my time to behaviorally adapt and improvise. Now, if it went so far where I thought, I don't recognize this party anymore, I have the same choice that every single member does, which is to go, well, it's not my party anymore. That would be pretty extreme. And I think there's a million options between that point. But I think it's always important to know that those boundaries are there. And I would know if the boundary had ever stepped. It's never even got close. I generally find if it's going somewhere I don't want it to be, speak out, and either my opinion's changed or the opinion of the party collectively has changed.
And if you did leave, that wouldn't be a problem, because if that, if like you probably would deliver the same speech as the things you believed in, and if the party was completely opposite to that, it'd be like, okay, there's no hard fitting, and actually the sort of, I think it's a maturity of perspective that can come with going, look, we don't need to agree on everything, but how do we love each other when we disagree? How do we peacefully use this as just it's fine, and I think that Annabelle and I speaking recently about an immigration issue. It's clearly a hot potato. It's clearly what we were sold in Brexit. It's clearly something we were sold that was not backed up by facts in terms of, well, we'll be so much better off if we had no immigration, and it also plays to this sort of siloization of perspectives, and it's ours and it's yours and it's this and it's that, and there's no facts behind it, and maybe we can't, maybe that is a point that is not one that is on the door knocking, because we've got a long way to go maybe before we get to free movement of people across anywhere in the planet, and opportunity comes, and that's the obvious utopia, in my opinion, to not disadvantage people because of where they were born, so let them travel. It's really quite radical when you take the world as it is at the moment to say, well, surely that's an intellectually obvious answer. Yes, let's do that. But how do you make sure that you don't, when you're doing the top level stuff, turn people off with some of those conversations? Oh no, he's going to let all those migrants in. All those, all going to, all this fear that maybe is not right. It's not, but it's a difficult one. How do you square the circle of when you're not at the door listening and doing that one-to-one bit, but you're doing the party political bit, that compromises need to be made about how, what you say and what you don't. Universal basic income, maybe another one. It's like, well, we can't march together as a party on that one at the moment because it's just too far. Or proportional representation. I could, almost, there's so many contention. I mean, Shell today just changed their ESG, their net zero policy, because they found some more gas fields to exploit. So they went, well, okay, we'll change our net zero, objectives. It's like, what? It's like, do you believe in decarbonisation or don't you? Well, I think there's your answer. So you're not going to change, but how do you square the circle with a sort of what to say, what not to say? Do you say it all?
Yeah,
it's too much.
I think that's a great question. I think actually the end of my story answers part of the question. So in Burnley that I was talking about, this happened, and then the Green Party went, well, should we turn up and counter these narratives? Burnley now has Greens running the administration or helping run the administration. Those are in the same places where the British National Party were earlier. Do I think those people have turned from hard right fascists to eco-socialists or whatever term people want to use to describe the Green Party? No, I don't. But what I think is the Green Party turned up and recognised people's fears. And I think that's the first part to your answer. I don't think politicians or anyone in any situation should ever be going, I know better than you, have all the answers, or that you're stupid or ignorant. I think it's about hearing people, recognising where they're coming from. And with immigration, the answer very often for me is people's fears are legitimate. It is really hard to get a dentist appointment at the moment. If you go to A&E, you might not be seen as quickly as you were 10, 20 years ago or when you grew up. But those aren't the problems of migrants. Those are the problems of 14 years of conservative austerity and arguably longer than that, neoliberalism and kind of Thatcherism that's ground our public services, to a halt, that hasn't put investment in them, and that has stoked divisions between communities. So to come back to your question very directly, what do you think I can do about this? I think you can tell the truth. And I know that can sound very twee, but I really think I'll give you a more complex answer. But actually, my very honest instinct, when I was listening to you, is just tell the truth. And I tend not to worry about consequences, which may be my downfall. And maybe, if someone was politically advising me, they might go, you need to think a few more chess moves ahead. But again, it might come from my improv background, but I just think people would read very quickly that you weren't being authentic or that you were playing games. And actually, no matter how clever you were, you would be, people can smell when they're being bulled, for want of a different word. And I think this screamed of Boris Johnson. Very charismatic, very engaging. You couldn't take your eyes off him. Same with Trump. But fundamentally, you knew in your heart something was wrong. And even when they're being articulate or flowing, you can just hear or sense, I'm not quite being told the truth here. And for me, if that had ever gone, then there's no point in me even being in politics. I should actually go do something else, because I think being able to tell the truth is the most important bit. Now, so I'm not being disingenuous. Is it sometimes hard to tell the truth, or is there more than one truth? Absolutely, and that's where it gets more complicated when.
But I don't think that I don't. Just to argue against you, I don't. This is not. This is about authentic. What is it that you believe in, and when you are saying, when you're answering questions, to be honest to what it is you believe in, and to make any honest differentiations between that and what the party might have said, or somebody else in the party, rather than to have this illusion that everybody is a robot and we all think the same. Well, I'm sorry, life's not like that, because we're a group of individuals and we just have so many, so there will, of course, the narrative in the media at the moment is so broken, because we tend to just, what is it that we can go, what is the number that you've committed to when what is this? It's like to try and pretend almost that there is one truth. And I think that although you've given a simple answer, I would sort of go, well, I think that's a profound answer, because the truth is messy. And if we're as in authenticity is messy, as in, is what I'm trying to say there. But do you think that needs an acceptance that we need to do politics differently? We need to change the conversation that we're having, that politicians lead us to, because we've got media, we've got politicians, and we're not able to really talk to one another anymore. We're just like soundbiting, and we're not talking about things. Do you think there needs to be a new conversation, a new form of how we talk to one another?
Yeah, there's almost no element in the political system right now that I wouldn't change from the top down. And in fact, I've just been reading a book that my colleague Natalie Bennett, who's in the House of Lords, former leader, has just written. And the book is literally called Change Everything. And even the way she printed the book was really interesting. So it's crowdfunded. So
Yes, yeah.
crowdfunded by a publisher, and then they've released it. And she talks in the book about the democratization of writing books, of podcasts, of how things go. So yeah, her phrase jumped in my mind when change everything, and I think that is true. Could I think of some examples that things are working, and I'd go, probably leave that the same. Probably, I can't think of any off the top of my head though. Generally, I think it's blatantly obvious that things aren't working, right? If something she writes in the book, which is the first time I've ever heard this phrase, and I love it. I'm going to start using it constantly, and I might not even credit Natalie for it because I'm going to use it so much. But I will. I'll behave today. She talks in the book about suppose it's the 1960s, and let's gloss over for a second the mass gender inequality that was in society, which is important to talk about. But for the sake of a metaphor, I'm going to pretend everything's fine. And things felt like they were generally getting better in the 60s. What happens if things had got better? We'd resolved gender equality, the disability pay gap, the ethnicity pay gap. What if we'd really brought down inequality? We had a universal basic income. People felt good about the world. Everything felt like society was working for everyone. But the one thing we'd missed and we didn't know about yet was the climate crisis. And then suddenly politicians had to say, you know what? The planet is burning. Species are going extinct. We need to change everything. That would be such a difficult political message. And I would like to think we'd be able to rise to it, and we'd be able to say to people, we're going to have to let go of this perfect society because we're going to have to transform it. Come with us. But we're not in that scenario. We're in a scenario where we have children growing up in poverty. We're in a scenario where inequality has never been bigger than ever before. We've got a scenario where politicians talk constantly about GDP and growth, but actually growth is better than it's been for a long time and is continuing to grow. Yet working people are paying more tax than they've ever had before. Working people are in universal credit. So even though they're working, they still haven't got enough to pay the basic essentials. We walk in our cities where we see mass wealth, but also there's homeless people living out of cardboard boxes. And we're saying there's a climate crisis. We need to change everything. The response should be great. We need to change everything anyway. So let's change it. Let's get on and change it, both for the planet, but the fact society isn't working. Anyway,
Well, we've made that point in a different way without the metaphor of the wonderful 60s, in that the situation post Brexit in the UK is so bad that once again the United Kingdom is leading the world because we're in such crisis. We are leading. The bigger the crisis becomes, the easier the change. And so, we don't have to necessarily try too hard to promote that change because it's coming. It's not. Actually, if you were to as you do as for a living, speak to voters, everything is wrong. Everything does need, but it's back to that. Who am I? Said 7 billion people. Am I really going to change the system? But actually, people to have the optimism that change is pretty easy if given the collapse trajectory we're on, at the moment. Annabelle, you're being very quiet, and your internet is good. So
no, I'm just mindful of just a lot of dog noise, I'm afraid, in the background. But yeah, I mean, lots. I feel we need to be aware that we're on a transition. I think that the change is coming. My daughter very sort of sadly sat in the car with me a few weeks ago, and she said, her feeling is that nobody will do anything like significant towards the climate change until we have a mega disaster, and we lose millions of people, and and then we will realize what we're dealing with here, which is a very sad very pessimistic viewpoint. But the longer we have Shell changing their mind today, the more I feel she's probably right, because we're just so pained in every way, as you just described, that having any capacity, any cognitive capacity to do anything is other than just carry on, is quite difficult for many people at the moment. So, where to begin, where to begin. And, I feel, I mean, I don't want to talk about what we're doing, but just to free up a bit of that cognitive capacity to allow people to lead the way, as you describe, because they have the answers, but they just don't have the time or the space to deal with the problems, because we don't let ourselves do that. So, I mean, that's
So where to begin? So as a young person who kind of goes, well, it's Conservative, I've got to vote Labour because I've got to get the Conservatives out. I'm not going to vote Green because they're not going to win, and they're not going to, So where to begin? Because voting Labour seems to be as
it's the same
terminal for our society as the Conservative department. It's just such a mess. So I'm a young person. I'm 58. I'm now 28. I'm 20. Where to begin is Annabelle's question. Where do I begin?
Yeah, it's an amazing question, and I can completely see where your daughter's coming from, and I'm going to say why I disagree. I actually feel
Hooray.
hopeful, and I feel more hopeful than I've ever before. And partly that might be just because of my job, and I'll accept that I'm, I get trains all around the country every single day, and I'm constantly seeing community projects. I'm constantly meeting people who are elected as green councillors, and they go, look at what we've done, look at what we've done. And yes, of course, they will almost always go, but Labour are stopping us, or Conservatives are stopping us, or the council more broadly are stopping us. But this is how we're resisting, and this is how we're making it happen. And the way, bar none, they're always making it happen is by groups of collective communities coming together and saying exactly what is phrased in your question. The Labour Party and the Conservative Party are not the answer here. Now, just a few years ago, if I'd said this, people might have resisted a little bit and gone, the Conservatives aren't the answer. But, Labour, we need them to get rid of the Conservatives. Now, there's still a little bit of that going on, but more than I've ever heard before at this election, people are recognising that these are two sides of the same coin. And although I'm not going to be churlish, I think Keir Starmer as Prime Minister will be an improvement on Rishi Sunak. It's not the improvement we need, nor will he create the solutions that match the scale of the crises that we have, whether that's the climate crisis, whether it's social justice, whether it's workers' rights. But I do think it's a step in the right direction. But I think what is clear is this status quo cannot continue. Now, I've given you the hope. Let me give you the despair. This does not mean things are going to get better. It could mean actually things could get significantly worse. And I think we're seeing that through reform. We're seeing that through the rise of the far right across the world. The only thing that is sure is the status quo cannot sustain itself any longer. So we're at this very interesting moment where things are about to get significantly worse, or my entire raison d'etre of what I do every day is let's make things get better. Some very quick stats. I'm not a politician that does lots of stats, but in the last 4 years alone, the Green Party have over quadrupled their number of seats at council level. Now, that was starting from a low base, yes, but that rate of growth is huge. Do I think that rate of growth is something fundamental about the Green Party? No, I don't. But I do think it's something fundamental about offering change, about recognizing that hope is possible, about offering a vision that's positive and tangible, about social, environmental, racial, and economic justice. I think these things all speak to where people are at the moment. And I think this idea that it's not run by politicians at the top, but actually this is a community project where people come together and make the difference, is something that people can get on board. Do I think this is big enough at the next election to radically transform our society? I'm afraid I don't. This is where my huge hope and enthusiasm dwindles for a second. I don't think there's going to be a green government. I don't think we're going to have enough people to make the change instantly that needs to be happened. What do I think can happen? I think we can win 3, 4, maybe more MPs who can hold Keir Starmer to account. Just that bigger block of voices. We've seen what Caroline Lucas can do with 1 MP. Just quadrupling that to 4 MPs means there's a significant presence that changes the conversation in the media. More people hear about the Green Party. More people understand they can get involved at the local level. People often message me and say, I went to my local Green Party. There was nothing there. Nothing was happening. I feel in despair that there isn't an organisation. What I say to these people all the time is, you can be that change. Why don't you get a group of people together, get a local Green Party running, run it how you want to run it in democracy? Obviously, lots of people don't say that to me. They say, I turned up to my Green Party, it was buzzing. We've got councillors, we're running the council, great. I don't need to talk to those people because it doesn't need my intervention. I just say, great. Email me, message me, let me know how it goes. I'll be cheering you on and I hope to visit soon. But what I'm really interested in actually are those kind of deserts where there isn't green activity going on, because actually it's so much easier then to get that transformation going, because there isn't a kind of history of this is how we've always done it, or this is the kind of politics in our area. There's just a group of people coming together for the first time and saying what your daughter's saying. We're not ready to face the climate crisis. Politicians aren't going to change anything. Let's not believe in politicians. Let's believe in this community right now. And sure, we might become politicians in the process, but the point is not to become politicians. The point is to be community people who stay in touch with our community, who get elected positions of power, to then keep this feedback loop going where we're listening to the community. That's what I'm really interested in. So yes, I talk a lot in national media about running councillors, about getting more MPs elected. That stuff's important. I'm not there to say it isn't. But if we ever lose the micro because we've got to the macro, we've missed the point entirely. And I see my job always to act as the conduit between people who feel like they don't have a voice, to then act to hold truth to power. And whether that power be Labour politicians, as it is now for me with Sadiq Khan, whether it be the Conservative government, or whether, frankly, that's future Green MPs that I need to say to, hey, are you still listening to your community? I still see that as a role, because if we get institutionally defensive, we've missed the point. We need to constantly be checking in and going, actually, people power is more important than the institution ever is. And that's important to keep keyed in with the communities.
Yeah, and it's that difference between, yes, I'm an MP and I listen to my community because I have like little workshops, and actually, giving people permission, not that they need it, but tacitly, of just get out there and start picking up litter and talking to other people about what you care about. And that is very different to what we're, that narrative. It's a different story than we've heard in our growing up with politics in the UK. So, maybe it's not tomorrow, but it's definitely going in a direction. So, Annabelle, I'm conscious of, time, and, we're just probably about the hour, although we took a long time to get going with technology issues. But,
stalling.
Zack, are there call to action? Is there final points you want to make? Things that we haven't covered that you'd like to say?
I think my call to action I kind of implicitly did in the last answer, actually, which is if people are hearing me and they're inspired by anything I've said, then please do get in touch with your local Green Party. I'll put that with the caveat that if there isn't a local Green Party, but you're feeling inspired enough, then get one started and get running. I think that's really exciting. I think what's my other call to action? I think it's to keep having these conversations, and as the world gets more complex and as things become increasingly complicated, I think we need to have these conversations even more. I'm thinking, things that jumped to mind straight away was some of the toxic divisions that there are in our politics and our society around what's going on with Gaza at the moment. I'm a Jewish politician. I've really felt the responsibility of speaking out what I see, or not what I see, what I'm pretty sure are atrocities that are happening, while still recognizing that there's a role to play for people who are fearful of the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And it's about those things, to me, clearly aren't in conflict, but the media often present them as conflict. So it's being able to hold that space. So I guess my call to action actually is to be compassionate to each other, whether that's in a political space or whether that's in any space at all. As Bill and Ted said, just, let's be excellent to each other.
No, what a wonderful way to finish. I've just enjoyed this enormously. It's been really taxing intellectually as well, because I just think it's not this sort of narrow-minded discussion that we have as sort of just okay, it's black, it's white, it's obvious, it's data, it's evidence-based. It's not. No, it's people. It's messy. It's very complicated. I just want to thank you for taking this time on a Friday afternoon where, most of us have probably sort of checked off for the weekend. I feel we're just getting going really now for our weekend's work. So,
come again.
It's really good to hear.
Zack, thank you so much, and until the next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye for now.